The following presentation about suicide and prevention in older adults is brought to you by Nathan, Bashama, Canella, Denise, and Lydia. This is just a breakdown of what to expect. We'll be having the introduction, background, what is known about aging, ways to improve, media advertisement, and the conclusion. Majority of the time, suicide is a hidden problem. Some individuals seem perfectly fine with no signs and symptoms of distress or depression. Many individuals may not even think about their loved ones committing suicide, or even know that it is an existing issue. News channels are a source of connection between communities and societies. Many individuals learn about illnesses, signs, symptoms, and more by watching what's going on the news or other media sources. Unfortunately, media sources do not speak about suicide, especially amongst the elderly. Suicide rates are the highest amongst seniors, something which surprises many families, individuals, and is overlooked. There are approximately 800,000 suicidal deaths worldwide each year. The Canadian annual suicide rate for adults over 60 years of age is 12 per 100,000 seniors. According to City TV News, the highest rates of completed suicide are of men above the age of 80, and weekly 10 seniors over the age of 60 die of suicide. It is important to address this issue regarding senior suicide, as the risks of these numbers will continuously increase as baby boomers age. As individuals age, they begin to experience many changes in their physical and social lives. Seniors begin to face unemployment and the loss of family and friends around them. As they age, their bodies begin to change and their health begins to deteriorate. Many reach a point where they cannot drive, walk on their own, and become limited of doing activities they love. Due to deteriorating health, they slowly begin to lack the independence they once had. These stresses may become overwhelming for some individuals, leading them to depression and suicidal thoughts. Baby boomers are of concern as they may not be able to handle these stresses of aging to come. Here we have provided some definitions for terms that will be used throughout the presentation. Prevention refers to actions which are taken to stop something from occurring in the first place. For instance, flu shots to avoid society from catching the flu. Is-path warm will be defined further in the presentation. This is a mnemonic for suicide warning signs. Baby boomers refers to individuals born after World War II. Further, we have the epidemiology. To gather information on suicidal deaths, epidemiologists monitor and evaluate the pattern of occurrences. They also consider the distribution of diseases. Psychiatric illness such as depression, physical illnesses which lead to a decrease in independence, and poor social connectedness are all factors which are taken into consideration. Of course, there are always other health concerns such as individuals' overall internal health and genetics. These factors are also taken into consideration.
Hello, my name is Lydia Chertzma and I will be discussing what is known about suicide. Research provides information and correlative factors between aging population and suicide, thereby helping in identifying who is at risk. Recapping what we have already heard, we know that globally seniors have a higher death by suicide rate compared to any other age group. However, research shows this finding is not consistent in every culture. One study looking at indigenous population notes relatively high suicide rates among the younger population and explains this may be due to the high ratio of youth that creates a lower population age. This is also labeled the baby boom, baby bust theory, as traditionally high suicide rates have followed the demographic shift with the population influx from the baby boomer generation. As the baby boomers are now entering in the senior years, rates of suicide among the older adult population are also expected to increase. Research has also identified specific risk factors that link suicide with the aging population. However, much of what is known has been learned from the retrospective analysis, which is subject to recall bias and other limitations inherent to retrospective data collection. Furthermore, the risk factors are ineffective at predicting suicidal outcome. For instance, much research identifies depression as a leading risk factor for suicide, yet other studies show the vast majority of older adults who are depressed neither think about nor attempt suicide. The large number of false positives that would result from widespread use of a single factor in identifying at-risk seniors would lead to unnecessary, intrusive, and expensive interventions for individuals who would not need them. For this reason, many studies have identified multiple risk factors between aging and suicide. Historically, many studies have focused solely on individual factors that can influence one's risk for suicide. Mental illness such as major depression, mood disorders, and anxiety disorders are predominant risk factors that have emerged from research. In a U.S. national survey of older patients with major depression, 42% felt they wanted to die, 25% thought a lot about suicide, and 4.7% had attempted suicide. Functional impairment, physical ill health, and disability also contribute to the risk of suicide in later years. One study from Ontario notes that seniors with 3 physical illnesses have 3 times the risk of suicide, and those with 7 or more physical conditions have 9 times the risk compared to seniors with no diagnosis of physical illness. Additionally, loneliness, stress, and substance abuse have been associated with an increased risk of suicide among older adults. Recently, more studies have analyzed social factors that may influence the risk of suicide for seniors. This idea was first introduced by Durkheim's sociological theory. He suggested suicide was a result of social and structural factors rather than individual ones, and analyzed suicide in relation to the greater society in which one lived. Social indicators that have been correlated with suicide rates include high unemployment rates, area-level deprivation or poverty, high male-to-female ratios, social fragmentation or poor social integration, and high percentage of single-occupant households. Risk factors for suicide are multifaceted. However, few studies investigate the combination of individual and contextual factors. In their study, New and associate researchers analyzed individual and area-level variables that may influence suicide in the older adult population. They compared 903 suicide deaths of seniors in Quebec to medical records to determine individual characteristics such as age, sex, prevalence of mental and physical health disorders, and utilization of healthcare services, including emergency visits and hospitalizations. Area-level characteristics reflect the geographical location in which the death occurred and was defined by the first 3 characters of the postal code. Death was obtained using the Canadian census and considered population density and the demographic of the population, including the ratio of males, seniors, immigrants, single-parent families, and education. Social fragmentation index was used to measure the lack of opportunity for social integration. Median household income was used to analyze poverty. Study results indicate that males were 9 times more likely to commit suicide compared to females, and seniors less than 70 years old were more likely to die by suicide compared to seniors over 70 years. Other predictors of suicide include emergency department visits, diagnosis of mental disorders, and substance abuse. Area-level predictors included high unemployment rates for men. However, this was not found to be a risk factor for females. Study results showed high population density increased risk for suicide. However, lone parent families was a protective factor for both men and women. Other social economic factors included poverty and a high population with little education. The study shows that individual traits such as sex, age, and health, as well as social determinants of health and their environment, influence the risk of suicide in the aging population.
Hello, my name is Denise Palvas, and I will be discussing the ways to prevent suicide in the elderly population. Research is critical to aid in the prevention of suicide. As mentioned before, suicide is most common among the older adult population. However, research on suicide prevention in old age remains a much neglected area. Even though suicide is a preventable act, death by suicide continues to be a major public health problem. So let's now look at part of a video about suicide in the older adult population in Canada recently posted by CTV News London.
At the top of the sky.
It's a busy spot at this seniors community center with dozens of daily activities, and those who attend say it's a much needed service.
You know, there's no point sitting at home being lonely. I'm a widow, so I don't want to be sitting at home all the time. So I'm out at least 3 to 4 times a week now.
But not all seniors are this active. In fact, a new study out of Lawson Health Research Institute shows that the majority of suicides in this country are people 65 and older.
Older men in particular have the highest rates of suicide worldwide.
Dr. Heisel says for men, depressive thoughts usually begin after retirement.
Many find they really don't know what to do with their time. Their sense of who they are has changed, and it's quite an adjustment to make.
The team at Lawson interviewed 109 adults over the age of 65 as part of the research. But one promising theme stood out.
Those who reported more meaning in life were more likely to report having more things to live for. They were less hopeless about their social relationships, less depressed, and actually reported fewer thoughts of suicide, if at all.
Research shows keeping active is key, whether it's going out for a coffee, hanging out with friends, doing physical activity, or coming to community groups like here at the Kiwanis Senior Center.
Video describes how important it is for the older adult to be involved in the community and to be socially active. So to prevent suicide in the elderly population, a collective effort is needed from families, organizations, mental health programs, and healthcare professionals to raise awareness and offer support. It is essential to implement prevention strategies to prevent suicide in the elderly population. There are universal, selective, and indicated prevention strategies. The entire older adult population is addressed with universal prevention strategies by reducing the risk factors for suicide and by focusing on improving the older adult's health. Universal prevention strategies focus on providing education about the risk and protective factors of suicide and healthy aging, and the implementation of self-administered depression screenings. Elderly people who are at increased risk for suicide, but who are not displaying suicidal behaviors or thoughts, are addressed with selective prevention strategies. Increased risk for depression and suicide are seen in older adults who go through life-changing experiences or transitions. For example, the death of a loved one, dealing with a chronic illness, or moving. Risk factors can be detected by using systematic screening tools. Healthcare professionals and the general population should be trained to screen for suicide risk to increase awareness. Social support is crucial for older adults who are going through life-changing experiences, and social isolation should be prevented. Indicated prevention strategies are used for the older adult population who have attempted suicide or at an extremely high risk for suicide. Supports needs to be provided to those who have attempted suicide. Community resources, social support, and follow-up is essential to help them recover. Since suicide and depression are closely linked together, antidepressants and psychotherapy might be beneficial. Other recommendations include home visits and increased social interactions to improve the older adult's well-being. Healthcare professionals should be educated to identify the risk factors and how to properly intervene and manage suicide risk in the older adult's life. It is important to assess and act on suicide risk and find professional support if needed. So to prevent suicide in the elderly population, it is essential to be aware of common suicide warnings. So the mnemonic ISPET WARM was created to help you remember these. So there are specific questions that you can ask when using this mnemonic. So for example, for anxiety, you can ask if the person feels anxious, agitated, or is unable to sleep. If the person has an inability to relax, or if the person is sleeping all the time. If any of the risk factors are present, it's vital to find support to ensure the client's safety. So the Canadian Coalition for Seniors Mental Health has also created a guide for family members to help them recognize suicide risk factors and warning signs, and what interventions to take if an older adult is at risk for suicide. It is a great resource for family members to review, and for more information you can click on the link that I've provided right here in the PowerPoint. To prevent suicide in the elderly population, a collective effort is needed, and education about the risk factors and prevention strategies is crucial.
I will be discussing elderly suicide in the media. I have selected this video called Reach Out, Speak Up, Suicide in the Elderly from December 2009. This video describes the struggles of our elderly community is encountering. This discusses their feelings and how their state of mind is, and what has gone undetected from family and healthcare professionals. This video is an excellent example of how this woman Lois falls into severe depression with struggles of suicide, and how Lois survived with family intervention and medical treatment. Please go ahead and watch this video.
Miss Harvey will never forget the day she thought about ending her own life.
One time I thought I should just drive in the river and it would all be over. And I thought, I can't do that. I wasn't raised that way.
That day came shortly after she and her family decided to place her husband, Dean, who had Parkinson's disease, into a nursing home. She had cared for him round the clock for 18 years. Common category. According to the website suicide.org, the elderly are only about 13% of the U.S. population, but account for over 18% of all suicides.
All right, look at how this goes with that.
Her children picked up on her changing behavior and stepped in to save their mother's life.
My family came to the rescue, made me consult a doctor who put me on a very light dosage of antidepressants, of which I was on for about 2 years. I started getting a life. I started doing the things I should be doing and got back out in public. I'm going to keep exercising. I'm going to keep traveling with the jazz band as much as I can afford to do it. I'm going to keep positive. I'm going to do as many things as I can to make other people happy. And I'm going to continue on life's journey and hope I have a long one.
I'd like to emphasize the growing concern in Canada that the elderly are facing is now elderly suicide. Here's an example of an article from City TV News called Canada's Elderly at High Risk of Suicide, Experts Warn. This article describes the growing concern our elderly population are having and that public awareness must increase. The article is providing knowledge of how society has missed the signs of suicide thoughts and attempts the elderly are having. In 2009, Statistics Canada stated that men aged 85 to 89 have the highest rate of suicide among any age group in Canada. The elderly are going undetected with their ailments and their mental illness. This describes the struggles and how the public must be aware. The media's influence is reinforcing that the elderly should be closely monitored, and the signs of isolation, depression, lack of appetite, and social activity should not be taken lightly. That immediate involvement to the correct health care professional is needed to evaluate the person's state of mind. Depression is usually the beginning sign that lead into suicidal thoughts and attempts. The media has been displaying accurate concern and is not portraying the elderly in a discriminatory manner, but is increasing concern to healthcare professionals, support staff, and family, increasing awareness and educating all persons involved with caring for the elderly must be aware of the initial signs of suicide thoughts. This slide is about what's up ahead. As we all know, the baby boomers, a post-war generation, are born between 1947 and 1965, started turning 65 in 2012. By 2032, Canada's population of seniors aged 65 or older will double. By 2036, the elderly will increase by 25%. By 2061, all but a handful of baby boomers will have passed away, but the number of the elderly will still range from 12 million to 15 million. This is why it is a growing concern that the elderly are living longer and health care and social programs will be needed, as well as the media has to continue to make awareness to all healthcare professionals that the elderly should be taken care of and should be monitored to avoid any elderly suicide or any elderly suicide thoughts. Thank you.
A suicidal senior individual may not ask for help, but that doesn't mean they don't want it. Most people who commit suicide assume that ending their life is the best solution, but it never is. Suicide prevention starts with recognizing the warning signs and taking them seriously. If you think a friend or family member is considering suicide, you might be afraid to bring up the subject. But talking openly about suicidal thoughts and feelings can save a life. So our take-home message to you is make elders feel like they belong, allow them to take part in your daily life, give them purpose. This was our presentation on suicide and prevention in older adults. Thank you.